Hello everyone! Hello! Cesare here with the final bit of weapon stories being the spear weapons from NieR Replicant version 1.22474487139. We're going to finish these off and that'll be the final video for my NieR Replicant series on YouTube. So enjoy these stories, thanks for viewing, and yeah. Transients. They were a frighteningly diligent people. They would clear forests and hunt animals even when they had no need. They developed techniques to preserve food that they were unable to eat and earned more money than could ever be spent. Yet there was not a single one among them who did not accept these practices, for none knew of any other customs. They were a frighteningly studious people. Their grasp of calculation and science exceeded any pretense of practicality, and they would repeatedly engage in spirited debates regarding predictions of the future. They invented an increasingly difficult language and created an infinite series of complex machines which they would immediately discard. But there was not a single one among them who looked back, for none knew of any reason for concern. They were a frighteningly obedient people. Without ever being told, they would greet the morning sun at the same time, in the same clothes, while toiling away in the same cramped rooms. Yet there was not a single one among them who complained, for none knew what else they should be doing. Having worked far too much, the people lost their forests and took to living atop the sand. Having grown far too intelligent, the people conversed in a language that no other peoples couldn't comprehend. Having grown far too well behaved, the people were unable to defy the laws that would establish one after another, and came to live their lives enclosed by tens of thousands of rules. Spear of the Usurper. In a far-off land, there was a man who acted as a double for the nation's prince, performing duties in his stead, as was required. One day, having finished his work, he returned to the prince's chamber to find the princess lying naked in his bed. As the double stood in place, dumbfounded, the man who shared his face sneered and invited him to join them. The double loved the prince's sister, and he felt that the princess, who admired him as her brother, loved him as well. Indeed, she was the only thing that kept him going on an otherwise miserable job, for the prince was a most despicable man indeed. Eventually, it came to pass that a war was to be waged under the prince's command. The night before it was to begin, the prince took his double aside and promised him a night with his sister if he could bring him the head of the enemy general. And as the prince chuckled with delight, the double took up his spear and thrust it through the prince's gaping mouth. The war over, the prince made a queen of his sister, and would inflict wounds upon his own face and throat, an act which would occur every time she called out to him using her brother's name. Before long, the prince was found dead, his face buried in a spear thrust through his open mouth. The man's face, hideously burned, was the very picture of serenity. The Devil Queen. This story takes place in a small country at around the same latitude as the northernmost member of a nation city-state that are part of a religion, with a village that is attempting to establish a trade agreement with another village on a tiny island in the ocean south of a country that used to have an alliance with a republic next to a kingdom where a queen resided. It was asked by the owner of a shop frequented by a wet nurse who looked after the child born of an adulterous relationship by the wife of the master of a foolish servant who fell in love with a beautiful queen who appears in the poems of a minstrel whom was loved by the king's wife, the country's king's wife's little brother's cousin's big brother's son-in-law's foster child. Where does one store the throne that was supposed to be adorned with decorations crafted from the materials of the handle of the lid of a pot that is the same weight as tableware, that is the same color as a weather vane on a neighboring house, that can be seen from the peephole of a door in the reflection of a mirror, with an ornamental frame decorated by silver carvings engraved with a fragment that was made when creating the whetstone used to polish this kitchen knife? Okay. The person who heard that question was the wife's husband's little sister's big brother's daughter's groom's little brother's nephew's father's mother's husband's bride's niece's father-in-law's wife's husband's little sister's big brother's daughter's groom's little nut brother's nephew's father's mother's husband's bride's niece's father-in-law's wife's husband's little sister's big brother's daughter's groom's little brother's nephew's father's mother's husband's bride's niece's father-in-law's wife's father's little sisters, big brothers, daughters, grooms, little brothers, nephews, fathers, mothers, husbands, brides, nieces, father-in-laws, wives, husbands, little sisters, big brothers, daughters, grooms, little brothers, nephews, fathers. Sunrise! In the distant past, the land known as the Golden Isles, there existed a sword crafted from every kind of metal and precious gem in the land. So sharp was its edge that even the slightest cut would leave an unsealable wound that eventually drained the victim of both their blood and life. In a strange turn of fate, the sword eventually ended up in the hands of a destitute woman who sold her body to get by. The sword was as long as she was tall, and she could not wield it effectively. So instead, she slid it between her sheets as a surprise for the men who used her. The sword was so sharp they felt no pain when cut, and soon died without even knowing it was happening. The woman would then help herself to their coin, causing her own purse to swell. Making use of her gains, the woman dressed most beautifully, and soon had acquired every kind of metal and precious gem in the land. But it was not enough for her, so she decided to melt down the sword and obtain the gems contained within, a desire made manifest by the sword's beauty. Thus, decided the woman, heaved the sword to her shoulders and made for the blacksmith. But on the way to the smith, the sheer weight of the sword caused the woman to lose her balance, and she fell from a bridge into the river below. The unshakable was the woman's greed. So unshakable was the woman's greed that she could not bring herself to relinquish her grip upon it. The woman's pale and bloodless corpse was found washed up on the riverside the following day. Beast Curse. Long, long ago in a faraway kingdom there lived 3 brothers. The youngest was a terrifically lazy lad who spent most of his days fast asleep. However, he was every bit as cheerful as he was lethargic, and so was beloved by all. The nation was beset upon by a contagious disease. The youngest son did not but laze about the palace, humming to himself all the while. But his cheerful music comforted the townspeople, so instead of hating him, they sang his praises. "Oh, what a fine young man," they would say. "Just the finest young man you will ever find." When the nation became embroiled in war, the youngest son did not but laze about the palace, telling stories of the good old days all the while. But his fascinating stories helped the townspeople forget about the horrors of war, so instead of hating him, they sang his praises. "Oh, what an amazing young man," they would say. "Just the most amazing young man you will ever find." One day, the youngest son was lazing about the palace as usual, when he realized he could no longer hear the voices of the townspeople, and so he wondered why that might be. He lazed and he wondered. He lazed and he wondered. He lazed and he wondered. Eventually, all that wondering tired him out, and he went to sleep. That is why, in the nation where all have perished from war and disease, the only sound that can be heard is the soft snoring of a young man. It is a nation of happiness, a nation of happiness, a nation of happiness, a nation of happiness, a nation of happiness. The Captain's Holy Spear. The captain tramples life under his feet. The screams of others transform into songs of joy. Flowing tears change from despair into darkness. Conflict beckons revenge and gives way to new solitude. The Dragoon Lance. He had grown old. The king's dauntless gaze had lost its light, and his stalwart body had grown soft. What's more, every ounce of fear and vanity he had gained with age now gnawed away at his heart. The king was afraid, so he repeatedly ordered the invasion of neighboring countries so as to hold on to the lands he had been sworn to protect. The king was afraid, so he tried to take everything through violence and oppression, for he no longer trusted his own advisors and vassals. There was a dragon that had sworn fealty to the king. This wingless creature would do anything the king commanded, for he had been saved by the king once, and sworn to repay his debts by his very soul. Even if the king's orders were folly and madness, the dragon would follow them to the last, for his king was justice itself. One day, the dragon requested an audience with the king. He was covered in blood from his latest victim, the king's own son, who the regent had ordered the dragon to assassinate. The bloody dragon hung his head low and said, "I cannot defy your orders, O king, but neither can I obey them any longer. I beg of you, kill me and grant me release." This is the tale of a foolish king and a wingless dragon in a nation that fell centuries ago. Even now, the wind blows ceaselessly across the grasslands. It blows just as it did on the day the king and the dragon made their pact. The Phoenix Spear. There was once a warrior in a frontier nation who feared not death. He was so brawny and powerful, arrows were said to bounce harmlessly off his flesh, and for this reason, the warrior always threw himself into the thick of any battle. One day, a beautiful bird appeared before the warrior in a dream. The bird commended the warrior for his valor in battle and offered to grant him one of two wishes. The bird could bring an end to war and grant peace to all the world, or the bird could bequeath the warrior an immortal body. The warrior chose immortality. From that day forth, the warrior's exploits were nothing short of astonishing. He mowed down foes in uncountable numbers. No amounts of arrows or swords or axes could slow his march. The king showered him with titles and gifts, and for a time, it seemed the warrior's day of stunning glory would continue until the end of time. But the conflict did not cease. Eventually, the warrior's frontier nation was invaded so often that the flames of war left the entire country in ruins. Crops withered, people perished, and before long, there were none left who knew the warrior's name. The shattered warrior was tortured day and night by endless starvation, and his body refused to let him die. So he sought out the bird again and pleaded for it to grant him release. "Ah, but you cannot die," chirped the bird in response. "You will never die." Labyrinth's Shout. She was a hopelessly slow woman. Impossibly clumsy, it would take her 3 times longer than anyone else to accomplish a task. She walked slowly, talked slowly, she even blinked slowly. So slow was the woman that she could not even draw water to anyone's satisfaction. The children began to call her the cow and laughed when she passed by, but she would only chuckle in response. She was a hopelessly dull woman. When she fell and drew blood, she would carry on as though in a daze. Though coins often dropped from her purse, she never managed to retrieve one, and if someone spoke ill of her to her face, it would take hours for her to realize the insult. When the children saw her, they would hurl rocks with glee. She was a hopelessly foolish woman. One summer, when the village was suffering a most terrible drought, the woman vanished. The children all starved to death. The villagers spent no time worrying about the woman who ran away. 2 days later, rain fell and the village was saved, but the woman did not return. And on the 20th day, a shaman arrived at the village. The shaman held a spear with a pair of horns that was oiled and sticky to the touch. So heavy was the spear that none could wield it effectively. Although, even if they managed to lift it, the weapon was incapable of piercing through anything at all. The woman forced it on the people and left it with them, but none dared approach it, and to this day it quietly slumbers in a forgotten corner of the village. The Fool's Accord. This is the story of a sorrowful prince, a tale of a kingdom in a time long past. Attacked by the forces of darkness, the nation was annihilated in a single night by inhuman soldiers with red eyes and a group of black dragons so numerous they blotted out the sky. Having infiltrated the king's castle, the black dragons visited upon the king and queen a most horrible fate. It is said that their stomachs were torn open by the black dragons' mighty claws, and the very floor they stood upon became a sea of blood. The prince and princess, though racked with sorrow, escaped to live another day. The prince, spurred by the shock of witnessing his parents' tragic end, became consumed by a desire to exact vengeance. This is the story of a terrifying prince, a history of a conflict in the long ago. Obsessed with laying low his hated enemies, the prince indulges in his vengeance day after day after day. Even when faced with foes who take heel, he chases them down and tears them apart from groin to gullet. The carnage is so horrific, his fellow soldiers whisper tales of how they saw mutilated bodies that are already long dead. Perhaps because no other commander can control him, the prince is set to an even harsher battle. This is the story of a fooled prince, the whereabouts of fate in the long ago. The prince's next battleground is a castle that guards a goddess. He lays waste to all before him, hacking arms, cleaving legs, rending stomachs, gouging eyes, separating heads from shoulders, but soon the injured prince can no longer tell the difference between the blood that rains down and that which comes from his own wounds, and he collapses in a heap. As he writhes in pain, coughing up gouts of hot blood, he lifts his gaze and sees a hated dragon standing before him. This is the story of a mad prince, a meeting with a dragon in the long ago. An injured red dragon stands before the prince, and though it is a different color than the beast that killed his parents, he feels the need to avenge himself upon it regardless. But as he raises his sword, the dragon says, "In exchange for both our souls, human, I will save your life and grant you power." After some thought, the prince makes the pact. It matters not to him that he might lose what he might lose in the deal, or that it involves a dragon. All he cares about is that he can continue swinging his blade, and so he swings and swings and swings, and with each blow his heart fills with a desire as black as the deepest night. And finally, the virtuous dignity. There once existed a cursed spear whose holder would inevitably meet a violent end. Eventually, the weapon found its way into a mechanical automaton that possessed no soul. And though it was a mere machine, the spear delivered countless deaths upon upon it all the same. The automaton warred against mechanical weapons such as itself. It was crushed to death, burned to death, and thrown into its death from great heights, yet each time the automaton was reborn and thrown into battle anew. The war became fiercer and more complicated. There were self-detonation, suicide attacks, false operations, the betrayal by companions. Indeed, it seemed to be the soulless automaton that it was inhabiting a kind of infinite cyclical hell. Finally, the automaton died a final time in order to save its trusted companions, an act that precluded the possibility of ever returning to life again. But as pangs of agony sped through its body, the automaton found its final rest. And there we have it, guys. That's going to be it for our weapon stories. Thank you very much for viewing. I hope you guys enjoyed. Like I said, I'm going to try and do this for Drakengard and Drakengard 2 at some point when I get back to them. Either way, guys, I love the weapon stories. I'm glad they brought them back for this version of NieR. They were sorely missing. But yeah. Have a good one, everyone, and I will see you later. Bye.